The golden afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the bustling streets of Elmwood City. Sebastian Hale wandered aimlessly, his tailored navy suit at odds with the storm of emotions brewing inside him. In his pocket rested an ivory envelope, a painful reminder of the invitation to his ex-fiancée, Camille's wedding. The thought of her marrying someone else fueling a stubborn determination to show he had moved on, even if it was a lie. As Sebastian drifted away from Elmwood's gleaming skyscrapers and upscale boutiques, he found himself in a less polished part of the city. Here, the streets told stories of resilience and hardship. His wandering gaze caught sight of a figure sitting alone on a weathered park bench. A woman, clearly homeless, was engrossed in a tattered book. It wasn't her appearance that struck Sebastian. It was the quiet grace in her posture and the sharp intellect glimmering in her eyes. Intrigued, he approached, unsure why he was drawn to her. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly. The woman lifted her gaze, her features marked by time and adversity, yet possessing a timeless beauty. Her voice, when she spoke, was unexpectedly warm. "Yes? My name is Sebastian Hale," he introduced himself, feeling an odd nervousness. I have a proposition for you." Her brow arched, a mix of curiosity and caution in her expression. "I'm Ellie," she replied, her tone neutral. "What kind of proposition?" Sebastian hesitated, suddenly aware of the absurdity of his idea. But the image of Camille standing radiant in her wedding gown beside another man spurred him forward. "I'd like to hire you to be my date for an event," he said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. "A wedding, to be specific. My ex-fiancée's wedding." Ellie's fingers stilled on the edges of her book. She regarded him with an unwavering gaze, her skepticism evident. "And why?" she asked pointedly. "Would you want to take a homeless woman to your ex-fiancée's wedding? To make an impression?" Sebastian admitted, his cheeks warming under her piercing scrutiny. "To show that I've moved on." A wry smile tugged at Ellie's lips. "Revenge," she remarked with a dry chuckle. "The noblest motive of all." Sebastian flushed but pressed on. "I'll pay you well," he added, his voice steadier now. "Enough to give you a fresh start if that's what you want." Ellie closed her book slowly, her piercing gaze not leaving his face. "And what does this fresh start involve?" she asked. "A complete makeover," Sebastian explained, finding confidence as he spoke. "New clothes, a polished look, etiquette lessons if needed. You'd become someone who could rival anyone in high society, for a few weeks at least." Ellie laughed, a sharp sound filled with bitter irony. "Do you really think you can snap your fingers and turn me into some modern Cinderella?" "No," Sebastian replied honestly, surprising even himself with his sincerity. "I think you already have something that can't be bought or taught. I just want to give you the chance to show it." A heavy silence stretched between them. The distant hum of traffic and the rustle of leaves filled the air as Ellie seemed to weigh her options. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter but no less resolute. "Why me?" she asked. "Out of all the people in this city, why choose someone like me?" Sebastian took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Because you have dignity," he said simply. "Even here, sitting on this bench, reading, what is it?" "Pride and Prejudice," Ellie admitted, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Sebastian smiled faintly. "You have a strength I admire, and frankly, you have nothing to lose and everything to gain." Ellie studied him for another long moment before sighing. "And if I say no?" "Then I'll wish you the best and be on my way," Sebastian replied honestly. "But I hope you'll say yes." Ellie closed her eyes briefly as though gathering courage. When she opened them, there was a fiery determination in her gaze. "All right, Mr. Hale, I'll do it." A wave of relief washed over Sebastian, mingled with an excitement he hadn't felt in months. "Good," he said, offering her his hand. "Shall we begin?" Ellie hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. Her grip was firm, her touch warmer than he had expected. "Before we start," she said quietly, "there's something you should know. I wasn't always like this. I had a career, a life, and I lost it all." Sebastian felt a knot tighten in his chest. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Don't be," Ellie replied, her voice firm but tinged with sadness. "Just understand this. I'm not a charity project or some pawn in your little revenge scheme. I'm a person, with dignity and history of my own." Sebastian nodded, respect blooming in his heart for this enigmatic woman. "I understand," he promised. As they left the park together, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting warm golden hues over Elmwood City. Sebastian felt an unfamiliar spark of hope flicker inside him. Little did either of them know, their unconventional partnership was about to change both their lives forever. Sebastian Hale couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far greater than a simple act of revenge. It felt like a turning point, something that could reshape not just his plans, but his entire life. As the sun dipped lower, painting the skyline of Lindale City in hues of gold and amber, the shadows of the towering buildings stretched long across the streets. Walking beside him was Ellie Brooks. Her head held high, her well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice clutched her chest. There was a quiet strength about her that Sebastian couldn't ignore. "So," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "where do we begin?" Ellie glanced at him, a mysterious smile curving her lips. "At the beginning, Mr. Hale. Always at the beginning." Under the velvety Lindale night sky, an improbable partnership was forged, one that neither of them could have predicted would challenge social norms and shake the foundations of their world. The first light of dawn filtered through the sheer curtains of Sebastian's luxurious penthouse. Ellie stirred in one of the guest rooms, her senses overwhelmed by the silken sheets, the pristine cream walls, and the sprawling view of the bustling city below. For a brief moment she wondered if she was dreaming. This life, these surroundings, they belonged to a world she had been cast out of long ago. A soft knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. "Ellie?" Sebastian's voice carried through, calm yet purposeful. "Are you awake? We've got a lot to do today." Ellie ran her fingers through her tangled hair, shaking off the remnants of sleep. "I'm up," she replied, her voice husky. When she opened the door, Sebastian stood there, impeccable, in a tailored navy suit. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than she expected, widening slightly as if he were seeing her anew. "Good morning," he said, a faint flush creeping to his cheeks. "Breakfast is ready. After that, we'll get started on your transformation." Ellie followed him to the kitchen, the enticing aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm croissants filling the air. Her stomach rumbled audibly, and Sebastian chuckled as he gestured to the lavish spread. "Help yourself. We need you ready for a big day." They ate in a companionable silence until Sebastian outlined the plan. A visit to an upscale salon, followed by a shopping spree at Lindale's most exclusive boutiques. Ellie listened, a mixture of excitement and unease bubbling within her. Finally, she set her coffee cup down and looked at him. "Sebastian," she began, her voice steady but curious. "Why are you really doing this?" Sebastian hesitated, his fork pausing midair. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the walls he kept so carefully built seemed to lower. At first, he admitted, it was about proving something, to myself, to Camille, to everyone. But now, he trailed off, searching for the right words. "Now, I think it's about something more. Maybe this is my chance to do something meaningful." Ellie studied him carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity. To her surprise, there was none. "You know," she said softly, "this won't fill the void Camille left." Sebastian dropped his gaze, a sad smile touching his lips. "Maybe it won't," he conceded, "but it could be the start of something better, for both of us." The day unfolded in a flurry of activity. At the salon, Ellie watched in astonishment as her reflection transformed. Her once limp hair gleamed with vitality, styled into an elegant cut that framed her face perfectly. Her hands, battered and rough, were meticulously manicured until they looked delicate and refined. In a high-end boutique, Ellie stood surrounded by racks of exquisite clothing. Each dress she tried seemed to awaken a different side of her, a version of herself she had almost forgotten existed. Finally, she stepped out of the fitting room in an emerald green evening gown. The fabric flowed like water, hugging her form in all the right places. "You look incredible," Sebastian murmured, his voice laced with genuine admiration. Ellie blushed, caught off guard by the emotion in her chest. "Thank you," she said softly, surprised by the sincerity of her own words. As the day wore on, Sebastian began to notice something remarkable about Ellie. It wasn't just her rapid adaptation to her new appearance. She had a surprising depth of knowledge about art, fashion, and etiquette. At lunch in a Michelin-starred restaurant, Sebastian leaned forward, curiosity etched on his face. "You seem to know your way around all this," he remarked. Ellie froze for a moment, her fork hovering midair. I wasn't always homeless, Sebastian, she said finally, her voice tinged with a sadness he hadn't heard before. What happened? He pressed gently. She set her fork down, her gaze distant. I used to be an executive. I had everything: success, status, a bright future. Then, a corporate scandal turned my life upside down. I became the scapegoat for something I didn't do. I lost my job, my reputation, everything. Sebastian felt a knot tighten in his chest as he absorbed her words. Ellie, he said softly, I'm so sorry. She gave him a faint smile, her eyes flickering with resilience. Don't be, she said firmly. I've learned a lot since then, about people, about myself, but it doesn't make it any easier. Their conversation hung in the air as they continued their day. Though Ellie's outer transformation was nearly complete, it was clear to Sebastian that she was rediscovering more than just her appearance. As they returned to the penthouse that evening, Ellie stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing at the city lights. Are you ready for what comes next? Sebastian asked, joining her. Ellie turned to him, her enigmatic smile returning. I think I am, she said, for the first time in years. And in that quiet moment, as the city shimmered below them, they both realized that this partnership was no longer just about revenge. It was the start of something neither of them fully understood. Yet, later that evening, Sebastian found Ellie standing on the balcony of his Lindale penthouse, bathed in the glow of the city's endless lights. The transformation she had undergone was stunning. She stood tall in her new elegance, but there was a melancholy in her expression that tugged at his chest. Are you okay? He asked, stepping beside her. Ellie turned to him with a faint, enigmatic smile. I'm just remembering who I used to be, she murmured, her voice soft and wondering who I am now. A wave of emotion surged through Sebastian. He hadn't expected to feel this way, not about her, not in the midst of what had started as a simple plan for revenge. You're extraordinary, he said, surprising himself with the sincerity of his words, not because of what you wear or how you look, but because of who you are. Ellie studied him, her eyes shining with something unreadable, something profound. Thank you, Sebastian, she finally said, for giving me this chance, not just to transform myself on the outside, but to rediscover who I am inside. They stood together in silence, gazing out at the city. What had begun as a calculated arrangement now felt like something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. For the first time in a long while, Sebastian felt truly alive. Night fell over Lindale, wrapping the city in its glittering embrace. In Sebastian's penthouse, two souls, each lost in their own way, found a fleeting moment of connection. It was a silent promise that this partnership would lead them somewhere neither of them had dared imagine. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Club shimmered with the light of countless crystal chandeliers. Every corner sparkled with opulence, from the polished marble floors to the delicate arrangements of rare orchids adorning the tables. It was the night of the Hale Foundation's annual charity gala, the pinnacle of Lindale's social calendar. Sebastian adjusted his bow tie, a mixture of nerves and excitement buzzing in his chest. Beside him, Ellie took a steadying breath, her fingers tightening slightly on the diamond-studded clutch that complemented her sapphire blue gown. Are you ready? Sebastian asked, offering his arm. Ellie's crimson-painted lips curved into a confident smile. Born ready, she replied, intertwining her arm with his. As the grand double doors opened, the hum of conversation hushed. All eyes turned to the pair. For a fleeting moment, Sebastian felt an unexpected pride as whispers of admiration rippled through the crowd. Ellie, for her part, moved with grace, as though she'd belonged in this world all along. Sebastian, darling, a familiar voice rang out. Vivian Hale, Sebastian's impeccably styled mother, approached with an appraising look that swept over Ellie from head to toe. And who is this? Vivian asked, her blue eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Mother, Sebastian began, this is Ellie Brooks. He felt Ellie's fingers tighten ever so slightly on his arm. Ellie, my mother, Vivian Hale. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hale, Ellie said, her tone warm yet polished. Your son has been a wonderful host. Vivian raised a perfectly arched brow. I imagine so, she replied coolly, her words laced with subtle suspicion. Sebastian has always had unconventional tastes in company. Before Sebastian could reply, another familiar figure emerged from the throng of guests. Camille Davenport, his ex-fiancée, was a vision in a scarlet gown that hugged her figure. She walked arm in arm with her fiancé Trevor, who looked less at ease in his tailored tuxedo. "Sebastian," Camille greeted, her gaze flitting briefly to Ellie before returning to him. Her voice was smooth, but the faintest flicker of surprise crossed her features. "What a pleasant surprise." "Camille," Sebastian said, the tension in his chest rising. "You look as radiant as ever." "Thank you," she replied, her smile tight, "and you must introduce me to your guest." Ellie extended her hand gracefully, meeting Camille's gaze with steady confidence. "Ellie Brooks," she said, her voice effortlessly composed, charmed. "Likewise," Camille replied, though the jealousy in her tone was poorly masked. "Are you new to Lindale?" "Not exactly," Ellie answered with a small, knowing smile. "I've been away for some time, but I suppose you could say I'm reacquainting myself with old haunts." Camille frowned slightly, her curiosity piqued. "Oh, and what circles did you move in before?" "The same as yours, I imagine," Ellie replied smoothly, her eyes glinting with a playful edge. "Though I've since discovered there's more to life than parties and idle gossip." A tense silence settled over the group. Sebastian felt both pride and apprehension as Ellie held her ground with a disarming elegance that left Camille visibly unsettled. "Well," Camille said at last, her voice clipped, "I do hope you enjoy the evening." As she walked away with Trevor in tow, Sebastian couldn't help noticing the lingering glance Trevor cast in Ellie's direction. "You handled that beautifully," Sebastian murmured to Ellie, a hint of awe in his voice. Ellie smiled, her composure unshaken. "You're not the only one who knows how to play this game, Mr. Hale." And as the night unfolded, Sebastian began to see that Ellie wasn't just playing a role. She was reclaiming a piece of herself, one that the world had tried to take away. As Camille strode away, pulling a bewildered Trevor in her wake, Sebastian couldn't help but notice the lingering look of admiration Trevor cast toward Ellie. It was subtle, but it didn't escape Sebastian's sharp gaze. Yet, he couldn't dwell on it for long. Ellie had already turned heads and captured attention in ways he hadn't anticipated. But the evening was far from over. Ellie continued to surprise him as the night unfolded. She moved through conversations with an effortless grace, discussing abstract art with a world-renowned curator, debating legislative reforms with a senator, and even trading light-hearted jokes in fluent French with a diplomat visiting from Paris. Her ease in navigating the social minefield of the gala left Sebastian both impressed and intrigued. "Where did you learn all this?" Sebastian asked during a rare quiet moment, his curiosity spilling over. Ellie glanced at him, a faint smile on her lips, though her eyes betrayed a touch of sadness. "A lifetime of experiences," she said, her voice soft. "Some good, some not so good, but all of them valuable." As the orchestra began to play a waltz, Sebastian offered his hand. Ellie hesitated briefly before taking it, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. As they moved in perfect rhythm, Sebastian found himself growing more captivated by the enigmatic woman in his arms. She wasn't merely a distraction or a tool for his plan. Ellie was a mystery, and one he wanted to unravel. "You're doing exceptionally well," he murmured, his voice low enough to be heard only by her. Ellie tilted her head slightly, her smile turning wistful. "Thank you," she replied, her emerald eyes gleaming. "But don't forget, Sebastian, this is just a role I'm playing. Don't fall for the illusion." Her words struck him harder than he expected. For the first time, he realized with unease that he might already be at risk of doing exactly that. Across the ballroom, Camille observed Sebastian and Ellie with a mixture of jealousy and fascination. Her polished exterior remained intact, but her mind raced. Turning to Trevor, who was now lost in a conversation about stock markets, she leaned in and whispered, "Who is she? And why does Sebastian seem so different with her?" Trevor, caught off guard, followed her gaze toward the dancing couple. Frowning, he replied with a hint of irritation, "Maybe he's finally moved on." "You should too." Camille ignored his tone, her focus locked on Sebastian and Ellie. There was something magnetic about the way they moved together, as though they shared a private secret no one else could touch. As the evening wore on, whispers began to circulate among the attendees. Who was Sebastian Hale's mysterious companion? Where had she come from? And how had she managed to win over one of Lindale's most sought-after bachelors so effortlessly? Ellie could feel the weight of the stairs and the expectations pressing down on her. Yet instead of crumbling under the scrutiny, she stood taller, every smile and graceful gesture serving as a quiet defiance against those who judged her. The night wasn't just a performance for her. It was a reclamation of the strength and poise she had once possessed. By the time the gala ended, the grand double doors of the Sterling Club opened to a sea of camera flashes and murmurs of admiration. As Sebastian escorted Ellie through the crowd and into the waiting limousine, she finally allowed herself to exhale. Inside the car, she let out a shaky but relieved sigh. "You were incredible tonight," Sebastian said softly, reaching for her hand. Ellie looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with emotion she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For tonight, for giving me this chance, for the first time in, I don't know how long." I felt alive again. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken possibilities. As the limousine glided through Lindale's illuminated streets, Sebastian found himself questioning the motives that had led him here. What had started as a calculated act of revenge was beginning to feel like something much deeper. Back at the penthouse, Ellie stood once again on the balcony, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She gazed out at the sprawling cityscape, lost in thought. Sebastian joined her, leaning on the railing beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, their connection deepening in the quiet stillness. "What happens now?" Ellie asked, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of the city. Sebastian turned to her, seeing not just the striking woman from the gala, but the layered and complex person beneath the surface. "Now," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips, "we keep moving forward. There are more events, more opportunities for you to shine. And maybe along the way we'll discover a few things about ourselves too." Ellie nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Sounds dangerous, Mr. Hale." "The best plans always are," he replied with a soft chuckle. As the night deepened, Sebastian and Ellie remained on the balcony. Two unlikely companions on the brink of a journey neither could have predicted. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the penthouse windows, painting the room in warm gold. Ellie sat at the balcony table, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. Her eyes scanned the newspaper spread before her, still foggy from sleep. Suddenly, her body went rigid. Her face drained of color as her fingers traced the lines of an article. The coffee cup trembled in her hands, a few drops spilling onto the paper. This can't be," she whispered, her voice shaky with disbelief. Sebastian, drawn by her distressed tone, appeared moments later. "Ellie, is everything okay?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with a mix of shock and pain. "Sebastian," she said, her voice trembling, "we need to talk." Ellie Brooks pushed the newspaper across the table toward Sebastian Hale, her hands trembling slightly. "Read this," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. Sebastian's brow furrowed as he scanned the headline. "Major corporate scandal resurfaces. Hale Industries named in investigation." His stomach dropped. "I don't understand," he said, looking up at Ellie in confusion. "What does this have to do with you?" Ellie took a deep, steadying breath, closing her eyes momentarily. When she opened them again, they burned with determination. "Remember when I told you I lost everything because of a corporate scandal?" she asked. "This is it. And your family's company, Hale Industries, was at the center of it all." Sebastian froze, her words hitting him like a physical blow. "That's not possible," he stammered. "What? How?" "I was the CFO of Novatech at the time," Ellie began, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I uncovered irregularities, massive financial discrepancies that implicated several companies, including yours. When I tried to expose it, I was silenced. My career, my reputation, my life. It was all destroyed." Sebastian shook his head in disbelief. "There must be a mistake. My father, he wouldn't." Ellie interrupted gently but firmly. "Maybe your father didn't orchestrate it, Sebastian, but someone at Hale Industries was deeply involved, and I paid the price." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken revelations. Finally, Sebastian stood abruptly, pacing back and forth on the balcony. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he demanded, his voice tight with tension. Ellie looked at him, her expression tinged with sadness. "At first I didn't know who you were," she admitted, "and then things got complicated." Sebastian stopped pacing, turning to her with a sharp look. Complicated? How? Ellie hesitated, her voice softening. Like the fact that I've started to care about you, she confessed, her eyes holding his. In a way I didn't expect. Sebastian's chest tightened at her words. A mix of emotions, guilt, confusion, and something deeper, churned inside him. I have to find out the truth, he said finally, his voice resolute. If my family had any part in this, I need to know. Ellie nodded, standing with him. I understand, she said. But be prepared, Sebastian. The truth isn't always easy to face. For the next several hours, Sebastian threw himself into uncovering the truth. He made call after call, rifled through old files, and called in every favor he could think of. Ellie watched from the sidelines, her heart heavy with the guilt of dragging him into a storm he hadn't seen coming. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to reveal itself. With each discovery, Sebastian's expression darkened, his resolve hardening. Finally, as the clock crept toward midnight, he ended a call and turned to Ellie, his face etched with betrayal and heartbreak. You were right, he said, his voice hoarse. My father, he knew. Maybe he wasn't the mastermind, but he allowed it to happen. He turned a blind eye to everything, for profit. Ellie approached him hesitantly, her voice soft. Sebastian, I'm sorry. I never wanted this. No, he interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't apologize. You didn't do anything wrong. If anything, I owe you an apology for what you've been through, for what my family's actions cost you. Ellie reached out, her hand gently brushing his arm. You're not responsible for your father's mistakes, she said quietly. Maybe not, Sebastian replied, his voice heavy with determination, but I am responsible for setting things right. In that moment, something shifted between them. What had started as an agreement, a calculated ruse, had evolved into something undeniably real. What are you going to do now? Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian met her gaze, his eyes a mix of vulnerability and resolve. I'm going to expose the truth, he said, no matter the cost. But Ellie, he hesitated, his voice faltering. I can't ask you to stay by my side through this. You've already suffered enough because of my family. Ellie stepped forward, her voice steady and sure. You don't have to ask, she said, taking his hands in hers. I choose to stay, not just for justice, but for you, for what we've built together. Their eyes locked, the weight of their shared pain and hope binding them in a way neither could deny. In the weeks that followed, Sebastian and Ellie worked tirelessly to gather evidence, building an airtight case against those responsible for the scandal. Each revelation brought them closer together, forging a bond that transcended their original agreement. One evening, after hours of poring over documents, they found themselves on the balcony once more, the city lights twinkling below. Ellie, Sebastian began, his voice trembling with emotion. I know this started as a lie, as a game, but what I feel for you now, it's the most honest thing I've ever felt. Ellie's heart raced as she met his gaze. Sebastian, Before she could finish, his phone buzzed loudly, breaking the moment. It was his lawyer, calling with urgent news about the case. Sebastian answered, his voice tense, but Ellie stepped away, her eyes lingering on his profile against the glittering skyline. She knew they were on the verge of something monumental, not just in their fight for justice, but in their own lives. The road ahead was uncertain, but Ellie felt a quiet strength rising within her. For the first time in years, she believed that together, they could face whatever came next. Standing on the balcony of Sebastian Hale's penthouse, Ellie Brooks let her gaze drift across the glimmering lights of Lindale City. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint hum of life below. For the first time in years, Ellie felt a glimmer of something she thought she'd lost, a spark of hope. It wasn't just hope for justice, but for a chance to rebuild, to start anew alongside someone who saw her for who she truly was. Sebastian hung up his phone and turned to her. Their eyes met, and in that quiet moment, no words were needed. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. The night deepened around them, the city alive with endless possibilities. On that balcony, two wounded souls found solace in each other, preparing to weather the storms that lay ahead. Camille Davenport stood before the ornate mirror in her bedroom, adjusting her wedding dress for what felt like the 100th time. The soft ivory lace cascaded down her figure flawlessly, but her reflection seemed wrong. Her usually bright, confident eyes were clouded with uncertainty. You look stunning, darling, her mother said, entering the room with a tight, practiced smile. Trevor will be overjoyed. Camille nodded absently, her hands smoothing the fabric of the gown. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. It drifted back to the charity gala, to the way Sebastian had looked at Ellie. It was a look Camille knew well, the same one he used to give her when their love had been new and untarnished. "Mom," Camille said hesitantly, her voice unsteady. "Have you ever wondered if you're doing the right thing, even when everything looks perfect on the outside?" Her mother paused, her smile faltering for the briefest moment before recovering. "Oh, honey, it's just pre-wedding jitters, completely normal." But Camille wasn't convinced. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of doubts and emotions. Every time she saw Sebastian and Ellie together, whether at social events, in the gossip columns, or in her restless dreams, she felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Jealousy? Regret? "I need some air," she muttered, lifting the hem of her dress and hurrying out of the room. The cool night air greeted her as she wandered through the sprawling gardens of the Davenport estate. Dew clung to the grass, dampening the hem of her gown, but she hardly noticed. The wedding was set for the next day, and all of Lindale was buzzing with anticipation. Yet Camille felt none of the joy or excitement she was supposed to. Her steps carried her to the old oak tree at the edge of the property, the very spot where Sebastian had proposed to her almost 2 years ago. The memory surfaced unbidden, his nervous laugh, the sparkle of the diamond ring, the overwhelming feeling that the world was theirs to conquer. "What's changed?" she murmured aloud. Then, as if in answer, a quiet voice spoke from behind her. "Maybe the question is what hasn't changed." Startled, Camille turned to see Ellie standing a few feet away. She looked calm and composed in a simple blue dress, the moonlight catching the faint shimmer in her eyes. "Ellie," Camille said, her voice a mix of surprise and caution. "What are you doing here?" Ellie stepped closer, her expression resolute. "I came to talk to you, Camille, about Sebastian, about you, about everything." Camille's heart began to race. "There's nothing to talk about," she said quickly. "I'm getting married tomorrow." "Are you?" Ellie asked softly, her words cutting through Camille's defenses. "Because you don't look like a happy bride." The comment hit Camille like a slap. She felt tears prick her eyes but willed them not to fall. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice trembling. "I know more than you think," Ellie replied gently. "I know you still love Sebastian, and I know he still cares about you." Camille shook her head, her confusion mounting. "Then why? Why are you here? Why aren't you fighting for him?" Ellie's lips curved into a sad smile. "Because this isn't about me. It's about you and Sebastian finally facing the truth you've been running from." The two women stared at each other, the weight of unspoken emotions filling the air. Finally, Camille sank onto a nearby bench, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "I don't know what to do. I love Trevor, I really do. But Sebastian, he'll always be my first love." Ellie sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "First love is powerful, Camille, but it's not always the right love." Camille looked up, surprised by the compassion in Ellie's voice. "How can you be so understanding? I thought you hated me." Ellie shook her head, her smile bittersweet. "Hate only breeds more hate, Camille, and I think we've all suffered enough." For the first time, Camille saw Ellie not as a rival, but as someone who understood her pain. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. "How did you end up like this?" Ellie drew in a deep breath, her eyes glimmering with distant memories. "It's a long story," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "A story of betrayal, loss, and eventually redemption." She paused, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "But we're not here to talk about me. This is your story, Camille. And you're the only one who can decide how it ends." Camille nodded, her mind swirling with thoughts and emotions she could no longer ignore. "I need to talk to Sebastian," she said suddenly, standing up with newfound determination. "Before it's too late." Ellie rose with her, a mixture of sadness and understanding in her eyes. "Do what you need to do," she said. "But remember, sometimes letting go is the greatest act of love." Camille turned to Ellie one last time, gratitude shining in her tear-filled eyes. "Thank you," she whispered before hurrying back toward the mansion. Ellie Brooks watched as Camille disappeared into the distance, her ivory gown trailing behind her like a ghost. Standing in the quiet garden, Ellie felt the weight of the moment. She hadn't come to confront Camille or to stake a claim on Sebastian. Instead, she had chosen to offer truth, and perhaps even freedom. Love, Ellie had learned, wasn't about possession. It was about letting go. Meanwhile, in his Lindale penthouse, Sebastian Hale was surrounded by a sea of papers, his desk a chaotic battlefield of documents and notes. He was laser-focused, tirelessly piecing together the scandal that had dismantled Ellie's life. The glow of the city outside barely registered as he dug deeper, determined to expose the truth. He didn't hear the door open until a soft voice broke his concentration. "Sebastian?" He looked up, startled. Camille stood in the doorway, still in her wedding dress. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Camille?" he said, rising to his feet. What are you doing here?" She stepped closer, her hands trembling. "We need to talk. About us, about the past, about what happens next." Sebastian's heart raced. He had dreaded this moment, yet a part of him had always known it was inevitable. "Camille," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. But before he could finish, his phone buzzed sharply, cutting through the tension. It was his lawyer. The timing couldn't have been worse. Sebastian hesitated, glancing between the phone and Camille. He was torn between the love they had once shared and the mission that now consumed him. Camille saw the conflict in his eyes and smiled sadly. "Answer it," she said softly. "Some things are bigger than both of us." Reluctantly, Sebastian picked up the call. Camille watched him as he spoke, her heart aching with every second. She saw the fire in his eyes, the determination in his voice. This wasn't the man she had fallen in love with. This was someone new, someone driven by purpose, someone she no longer recognized. When the call ended, Sebastian turned back to Camille, but she held up a hand to stop him. "You've changed," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "And maybe that's a good thing, but I know now that the man I loved, he's gone." "Camille, she shook her head. "No, I understand, and I think I know what I need to do." With a heavy heart but a strange sense of peace, Camille turned and left. As night fell over Lindale, 3 lives reached a crossroads. Camille wrestled with the hardest decision of her life. Sebastian stood on the edge of a revelation that could change everything, and Ellie waited in the shadows, her heart heavy but her conscience clear. Fate had intertwined their paths in ways none of them could have foreseen, and now, on the eve of a wedding that might never happen, the future hung in delicate balance. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Hall glowed under the soft light of hundreds of candles. A string quartet played softly, their music weaving through the murmurs of conversation. It was the night of Camille's rehearsal dinner, an event meant to be filled with celebration and anticipation. But beneath the surface, tension crackled like an unspoken storm. Sebastian stood near the bar, nervously adjusting his bow tie. His eyes scanned the room until they found Ellie. She was radiant in an emerald green dress, her laughter ringing out as she charmed a group of guests. For a fleeting moment, their gazes met, and Sebastian felt his chest tighten. Across the hall, Camille watched the exchange. Her white cocktail dress felt impossibly heavy, a constant reminder of a future she was no longer sure she wanted. "Are you all right, darling?" Trevor asked, placing a gentle hand on her back. Camille forced a smile. "Yes, just a little nervous, that's all." Before Trevor could respond, a sudden murmur rippled through the room. All eyes turned toward the entrance as Theodore Hale, Sebastian's father, strode in. His expression was thunderous, his presence commanding. "Sebastian," Theodore's voice boomed as he crossed the room, his anger palpable. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Silence fell as the guests turned to watch. The air grew thick with tension as Theodore confronted his son, his face a mask of fury. Sebastian straightened, meeting his father's gaze with a mixture of resolve and sadness. "I'm doing the right thing, Dad, something we should have done a long time ago." Theodore grabbed Sebastian's arm, pulling him close. "Do you have any idea what's at stake? What this will cost us?" Sebastian Hale's voice was calm but unyielding as he faced his father. "Do you have any idea how many lives were destroyed by the choices we made, by the greed we allowed to grow unchecked?" Ellie Brooks stood nearby, her heart pounding as she watched the confrontation unfold. She knew this was more than just a reckoning between Sebastian and Theodore Hale. It was a moment that would determine the fates of everyone tangled in the web of corruption that had shattered so many lives, including hers. Camille, sensing the tension, hesitated before stepping closer. "What's happening?" she asked cautiously, glancing between Sebastian and his father. It was Ellie who answered, her voice steady yet laced with emotion. "The truth, Camille. The truth that's been buried for too long." And then, as the room fell silent, Ellie began to tell her story. She spoke of her rise as a promising young executive, the discovery of damning financial irregularities, and the ruthless conspiracy that followed. She described how her career, reputation, and life had been destroyed by a scandal engineered by those at the highest levels of power. Her words cut through the murmurs in the room like a blade. Theodore's face grew pale, his composure crumbling under the weight of her accusations. Camille gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in horror. Trevor, who had been standing silently nearby, finally stepped forward. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice sharp, his eyes locking onto Theodore. "Did Hale Industries really do this?" Theodore opened his mouth to respond, but Sebastian cut him off. "Yes," Sebastian said firmly, his voice resonating through the room. "It's true, and I have the proof." A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. Friends, family, and business associates exchanged stunned glances, struggling to process the revelation. "You can't do this, Sebastian," Theodore hissed, his voice trembling with desperation. "You'll destroy everything we've built." "No, Dad," Sebastian replied, his tone unwavering. "I'm saving what little integrity we have left." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment the room seemed frozen in time. Then Camille stepped forward, her eyes glistening with both sadness and newfound clarity. "Sebastian," she said softly, "I understand now. I understand why you've changed, and why we couldn't be together anymore." Sebastian turned to her, his heart heavy with gratitude. "Camille, Before he could finish, Theodore, in a final act of desperation, grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and hurled it in Ellie's direction. "You!" Theodore bellowed, his voice breaking. "You've ruined everything." Time seemed to slow. Sebastian instinctively moved to shield Ellie, but before he could, Camille stepped in front of her. The champagne splashed across the pristine white of Camille's dress, staining it irreparably. A stunned silence fell over the room. "Enough," Trevor's voice boomed, cutting through the tension like thunder. He turned to Theodore, his expression fierce. "Mr. Hale, I think it's time for you to leave." Security guards appeared seemingly out of nowhere, escorting a furious and humiliated Theodore out of the hall. In the chaos that followed, Sebastian found himself at the center of a storm of emotions. He looked at Camille, who stood with Trevor's arm protectively around her. She smiled at Sebastian, a bittersweet warmth in her eyes. "Be happy," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears she was holding back. "You deserve it." Sebastian nodded, his chest tightening with gratitude. Then he turned to Ellie. Her gaze was filled with a mixture of love and understanding, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for his. "Ellie," he began, his voice low but steady. "You've shown me what really matters in life: courage, integrity, and love. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your love." Tears welled in Ellie's eyes as she smiled, her voice breaking with emotion. "I love you too, Sebastian," she said. "With all your flaws and virtues, I love you." The room, which had moments before been consumed by chaos, fell silent as every pair of eyes turned to the couple. It was Camille who broke the silence, her voice strained but sincere. "Be happy, you two," she said, her smile faint but genuine. "You've earned it." Trevor leaned in, whispering something to Camille that made her laugh softly for the first time that evening. "How about we make a fresh start?" he suggested. "No pressure. Just the two of us." Camille looked at him, really seeing him for the first time in months. "I'd like that," she replied gently. As the evening unfolded, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted. What had begun as a rehearsal dinner on the brink of collapse transformed into a celebration of truth, redemption, and new beginnings. Sebastian and Ellie danced in the center of the ballroom, their gazes locked, the rest of the world fading away. In a quiet corner, Camille and Trevor spoke intimately, rediscovering the bond that had brought them together. And so, on a night that had been meant as the prelude to a wedding, new stories of hope, and love began to take root. The scandal that had destroyed so many lives would now be exposed, paving the way for healing and justice. As the soft strains of the string quartet filled the air, Sebastian held Ellie closer, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. Ellie Brooks leaned into Sebastian Hale's embrace, a warmth spreading through her that she hadn't felt in years. She rested her head on his shoulder, a small smile playing on her lips. "Thank you," Sebastian whispered softly. "For what?" Ellie asked, tilting her head to look at him. "For showing me the way back to myself," he replied, his voice filled with gratitude and love. Ellie's smile deepened as she murmured, "We're just getting started, Sebastian. There's a long road ahead." Under the golden light of the ballroom, two souls, once fractured by the world, found healing and purpose in each other. What had begun as an act of convenience had transformed into something true and enduring. The night, which should have marked the end of a story, instead became the beginning of a new chapter, one full of uncertainty, but also hope. As dawn broke over Lindale City, the rising sun cast its light across Sebastian's penthouse. Ellie sat on the balcony, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She stared at the horizon, reflecting on the whirlwind of the past weeks. The highs, the lows, the revelations, it had been a journey of transformation in every sense. Sebastian stepped out onto the balcony, his face marked with exhaustion, but his eyes alight with determination. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft as he joined her. Ellie handed him a cup of coffee, her smile gentle. "Morning. Ready for today?" Sebastian nodded, taking a sip of the rich brew. "As ready as I'll ever be," he said. "Today we exposed decades of corruption, and my father's complicity in it." Silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of what was to come. Finally Ellie broke it, her voice barely a whisper. "Sebastian, there's something you need to know. Something I uncovered last night." Sebastian turned to her, concern etched across his face. "What is it?" Ellie took a deep breath, summoning her courage. "It's not just your father. The conspiracy goes far beyond him. Some of the most powerful executives in the country are involved." She hesitated, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And my downfall, it wasn't just a corporate decision. It was orchestrated by someone I trusted completely, my mentor, Robert Sinclair." Sebastian's chest tightened. He knew Sinclair well, a titan of the industry, respected and revered. The idea that he could be at the center of such deceit was almost unfathomable. "Ellie," he murmured, pulling her into a firm embrace. "I'm so sorry." Ellie pulled back gently, her resolve hardening. "I spent all night going through the files. There's a clear pattern, Sebastian, a pattern only someone with immense power and influence could orchestrate." Sebastian nodded slowly, the puzzle pieces clicking into place in his mind. "This changes everything," he murmured. "It does," Ellie agreed. "And it's why we need to be more careful than ever. Sinclair has connections. He can manipulate people at every level. If we're going to reveal the truth, we need to prepare for the fallout." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and frantic preparation. Together, Sebastian and Ellie pored over every document, ensuring their evidence was airtight. By early afternoon, they arrived at the towering headquarters of Hale Industries. The lobby buzzed with reporters and flashing cameras, the tension palpable as everyone awaited the press conference. Sebastian glanced at Ellie, who stood beside him, strong and unwavering. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. Ellie reached for his hand, giving it a firm squeeze. "Absolutely. It's time for the truth to come out." Taking a deep breath, they stepped into the packed conference room. The air was electric, the room crowded with journalists, executives, and, to Sebastian's surprise, his father, Theodore Hale, seated in the front row. Theodore's expression was a mask of barely concealed rage. Sebastian approached the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the sea of expectant faces, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. With a steadying breath, he began. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We've gathered today to uncover a truth that has been buried for far too long. A truth about corruption, greed, and the lives destroyed in the name of profit." As Sebastian spoke, he detailed the evidence he and Ellie had uncovered. His words painted a grim picture of corporate betrayal, laying bare the greed that had tainted some of the most powerful institutions in the country. The room was silent, the weight of his revelations sinking in. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras captured every word, and the tension grew thicker with each passing moment. Sebastian Hale gripped the edges of the podium, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overtake him. "We've laid bare the financial manipulations, the bribes, and the ruined lives. But the most shocking revelation," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "is that this conspiracy was orchestrated not only by my father, Theodore Hale, but also by one of the most respected figures in our industry, Robert Caldwell." A stunned murmur rippled through the packed conference room. Theodore Hale shot to his feet, his face red with fury. "This is absurd," he shouted. "You have no proof." Ellie Brooks stepped forward, her voice calm yet unyielding. "But we do," she said, her gaze locking onto Theodore's. "And I am living proof of the consequences of your actions." The room fell silent as Ellie began to tell her story. Her voice, steady at first, grew stronger with every word as she described her meteoric rise in the corporate world, her discovery of massive financial corruption, and the devastating fallout when she tried to expose the truth. She recounted how she was betrayed by those she trusted most, her career and reputation obliterated in the name of preserving power and profit. Sebastian watched as the audience absorbed Ellie's words. He saw disbelief, shock, and finally understanding flicker across the faces in the room. Theodore, meanwhile, slumped back into his chair, his bluster giving way to despair. And then the room was thrown into chaos. The double doors opened, and Robert Caldwell himself entered, flanked by federal agents. His normally composed demeanor was gone, his face pale and his shoulders hunched in defeat. "It's true," Caldwell said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "Everything they said is true." Gasps erupted from the crowd as journalists shouted questions and cameras flashed frantically. Theodore Hale attempted to slip away in the confusion, only to be stopped by more agents entering the room. In the midst of the pandemonium, Sebastian's eyes found Ellie's. In her gaze, he saw a mix of relief, sadness, and an unshakable hope. Without hesitation, he extended his hand, and she took it, their fingers intertwining in a silent show of solidarity. Hours later, as the dust began to settle, Sebastian and Ellie found themselves alone on the rooftop of Hale Industries. The sun was setting, painting the Lindale skyline in hues of orange and pink. "It's over," Ellie said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "It's finally over." Sebastian pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if anchoring them both to this moment. "No, my love," he murmured against her hair. "This is just the beginning." They stood there, embracing as day gave way to night. Below them, the city pulsed with life, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift that had taken place in the halls of power. "What do we do now?" Ellie asked, her voice quiet but steady. Sebastian smiled, his expression full of promise and possibility. "Now, we rebuild. Not just our lives, but the company. We'll turn it into something we can be proud of, something that actually makes a difference in the world." Ellie felt her heart swell with admiration and love for the man standing before her. A man who had risked everything for truth and justice. "Together?" she asked, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "Together," Sebastian confirmed, leaning down to kiss her softly. As the first stars began to dot the Lindale night sky, Sebastian and Ellie stood entwined, their hearts beating in perfect harmony. They had faced the worst the corporate world could throw at them, and had emerged stronger, more united. The road ahead would be far from easy. It would be riddled with challenges and unforeseen obstacles. But now they had each other, and the certainty that together they could overcome anything. Standing atop the world, Sebastian and Ellie gazed toward a future brimming with hope. It was a future undefined, yet filled with purpose, love, and the promise of making a genuine impact. The night enveloped Lindale in its dark embrace, but for them, it was the dawn of a new era, an era of truth, an era of integrity, an era of love. Side by side, hand in hand, their journey continued. It was the end of one story, and the beginning of another, more beautiful and true than either could have ever imagined. If you've been captivated by this tale, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support inspires me to keep sharing stories that move, inspire, and thrill you. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you again soon for another incredible story.